What happens when a man who has spent a lifetime fighting for his country is told he doesn't belong in his own hometown diner? The answer will shock you, and it will change the way you see the quiet corners of your own world. Stick around, because this isn't just a story about a steak dinner. This is a story about the soul of a town and the breaking point of a quiet warrior. Do us a huge favor right now, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next story, and drop a comment down below telling us if you've ever had to stand up for something you believe in, no matter the cost. You won't want to miss a single second of this. It began, as so many reckonings do, on a perfectly ordinary Friday evening. For Arthur Morgan, an old-timer carved from the same stubborn oak as the East Texas pines, Friday meant one thing: the Hickory Barrel Steakhouse. At precisely 6:15 p.m., his meticulously maintained 1998 Ford F-150, a relic of a more honest American era, would sigh into its usual parking spot at the far end of the gravel lot, the one shaded by a dying cypress tree. The truck's engine would cut out with a familiar shuddering cough, and Arthur would emerge not as a man going to dinner, but as a sentinel taking his post. He was 72 years old, though his movements held the careful precision of a man half his age. His uniform was unchanging: faded denim jeans with a razor-sharp crease ironed in that morning, a dark blue pearl-snap shirt buttoned to the collarbone, and the faded olive-drab cap he'd been issued in a humid jungle half a world away a lifetime ago. The cap was tilted just so, casting a perpetual shadow over eyes that saw more than they ever let on. He was a creature of habit, a man who found sanctuary in ritual. And in a town like Jasper Creek, population 4,800 rituals were the bedrock of existence. Inside the Hickory Barrel smelled of charred beef, spilled beer, and cheap wood polish, the holy trinity of Texas steakhouses. The air was thick with the low rumble of conversation from farmers in John Deere hats, oil rig mechanics with grease permanently etched into their knuckles, and the occasional high school couple fumbling through a first date. Arthur didn't require a menu. The laminated plastic rectangle was an insult to his 6 years of unwavering loyalty. His order was a prayer he recited every Friday, a 12-ounce ribeye medium rare, with a side of loaded baked potato and a heap of fried okra. His drink a tall glass of unsweetened iced tea with exactly one slice of lemon. He navigated the labyrinth of worn wooden tables to his booth, the one tucked into the corner by the large bay window. From this vantage point, he had a clear line of sight to both the main entrance and the parking lot. A strategic position. A holdover from a time when seeing what was coming meant the difference between breathing and not. The townsfolk of Jasper Creek had long ago learned to give him his space. They didn't mistake his silence for weakness. They recognized it for what it was: the quiet gravity of a man who had earned his peace through immense violence, and now guarded it fiercely. But tonight, the sacred rhythm was broken. The universe had nudged a single crucial pawn out of place. His usual waitress, a boisterous woman named Brenda, with a laugh that could curdle milk, was nowhere in sight. Instead, a new girl approached his table, moving with the nervous, jerky motions of a fawn testing a frozen lake. She couldn't have been more than 25, with pale, freckled skin and a blonde ponytail pulled so tight it seemed to be the only thing holding her upright. Her cheap apron was cinched at the waist, and her notepad was gripped in her hand like a shield. The name tag, pinned slightly crooked, read, Sarah. She offered a smile, but it was a brittle, fragile thing that didn't reach her wide, haunted eyes. "Evening, sir. I'm Sarah. I'll be taking care of you tonight. Can I start you with a drink?" Arthur looked up from his vigil at the parking lot, his gaze settling on her for the first time. It was a heavy gaze, layered with decades of appraisal, and he saw the flicker of panic in her eyes before she stamped it out. Unsweet tea, he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. 1 lemon. Yes, sir. Her pen scratched frantically across the paper, as if the words themselves were trying to escape. She started to turn away, a visible wave of relief washing over her. And a 12-ounce ribeye, he added, stopping her in her tracks. Medium rare, potato loaded, fried okra. She blinked, startled. Oh, right, of course. She jotted it down the pen, dancing a nervous little jig on the notepad. Comin' right up, when she fled toward the kitchen as if the devil himself were on her heels. It should have been the end of it. An awkward but ultimately forgettable interaction. But it wasn't. 5 minutes ticked by, then 10. The glass of tea finally arrived, delivered with a trembling hand that made the ice cubes clatter like chattering teeth. She set it down, and was gone before he could even look up. He took a slow, deliberate sip. The tea was lukewarm, and there was no lemon. An oversight. Annoying, but forgivable. He let it go. The real disturbance came a few minutes later. Sarah reappeared, but she wasn't carrying a plate. She wasn't carrying anything. She simply stood beside his table, wringing her hands in her apron, her eyes darting nervously toward the swinging double doors of the kitchen, and then to a shadowed corner of the restaurant. I'm sorry I didn't get your name, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the jukebox whine of a George Strait song. Arthur. She leaned in, a scent of cheap floral perfume and pure terror drifting from her. Arthur, she repeated, her voice cracking. She took a shaky breath, then plunged forward, the words spilling out in a desperate, hushed torrent. They told me to tell you. They don't want you here tonight. The 7 words landed on the table with the force of a lead weight. They hung in the air, thick and poisonous, sucking the oxygen from the space around him. Arthur didn't flinch. He didn't react in any way a normal man would. Instead, a profound stillness settled over him. It was the same stillness that had served him well in ambush alleys and booby-trapped rice paddies. His posture didn't change, but his mind, his very being, shifted from diner to threat assessment. His eyes, which had been scanning the parking lot, now scanned her face, dissecting her expression, searching for the truth beneath the fear. He let the silence stretch, coiling it like a snake, until she looked like she might shatter. Finally, he spoke, his voice as calm and steady as a surgeon's hand. Run that by me again. Her eyes, wide and pleading, darted across the dining room. The ambient noise of the hickory barrel seemed to mock the tension at their table. Laughter erupted from a booth filled with construction workers. Silverware scraped against ceramic. No one had any idea that a fuse had just been lit. She leaned closer still, her voice a ghost of a whisper. I'm not supposed to say anything, but they don't want you here. I heard them talking. They want you to leave. I thought you should know. Arthur's hand, resting on the worn vinyl of the booth seat, curled into a loose fist, the knuckles white. His voice dropped an octave, the gravel turning to granite. Who's they? She didn't have to answer with words. Her gaze flickered for just a fraction of a second toward the darkest corner of the restaurant, a booth tucked away behind a fake potted plant, a realm of perpetual shadow. 4 men sat there. Their laughter was too loud, their postures too relaxed, a deliberate performance of dominance. One was a mountain of a man with a shaved head and arms covered in faded prison-quality tattoos. Another, lean and wiry, sported a meticulously trimmed goatee and a smirk that seemed permanently etched onto his face. The other 2 were interchangeable clones in trucker hats and grimy work shirts. Their eyes, however, were not interchangeable. They were hard, cold, and they were fixed with an unsettling intensity right on him. Arthur turned his gaze back to Sarah, his expression unreadable. You certain that message was for the old man with the veteran's cap? Her reply was swift and raw. They described you down to the crease in your jeans. Said the window watcher needed to find a new spot, and a tremor ran through her voice. Please, sir, don't make trouble. For your sake. And for mine. The implication hung between them heavier than any spoken threat. He wasn't just being warned. He was being told that his presence was putting this terrified young woman in jeopardy. He sat back the vinyl of the booth, groaning in protest. He crossed his arms over his chest, a fortress of defiance. He looked at her truly, looked at her trying to read the unwritten history in her exhausted eyes. She wasn't a troublemaker. She was a casualty, a messenger caught in a war she never signed up for. And something in her gaze, a spark of desperate decency, told him this wasn't some petty diner squabble. This was something rotten. Something that had been festering in the dark corners of Jasper Creek for a long, long time. And Arthur Morgan was not a man who ran from rot. He was a man who dug it out, even if it meant burning the whole damn place to the ground to do it. What would you do in that situation? Would you quietly get up and leave, avoiding a conflict you didn't ask for? Or would you stay, knowing your decision could have consequences for a total stranger? Let us know your honest answer in the comments below. And if you're finding this story as gripping as we are, make sure you're subscribed because the storm is just beginning to gather. Arthur Morgan let the silence sit, letting Sarah feel the weight of his consideration. He was a master of a psychological warfare learned in places where a wrong move meant a flag-draped coffin. He watched her twist the corner of her order pad, her knuckles bone white. She was terrified, but she hadn't run. She had delivered the message. That took a specific, quiet kind of courage he recognized. It was the same courage he'd seen in 19-year-old medics running into a firefight with nothing but a canvas bag of bandages. You want to sit down, Sarah? He asked, his voice unexpectedly gentle. Her eyes shot toward the kitchen doors, a place of sanctuary and of command. A muffled shout for 2 sirloins on the fly echoed out. She was on the clock. She was visible. I can't. I'll get in trouble. You're already in trouble. Arthur stated not as a threat, but as a simple, unadorned fact. Pull up the chair. She hesitated for a beat, a war raging behind her eyes. Then, with a quick, decisive movement, she pulled out the heavy oak chair from the adjacent empty table and sank into it. It was the posture of someone stealing a moment of rest in the middle of a marathon. I can't stay long, she murmured. Her gaze fixed on her hands, which she had clasped together on the table to stop them from shaking. Then talk fast, Arthur commanded, keeping his voice a low, confidential rumble. What exactly did you hear, and who exactly did you hear it from? She took a shaky breath, the kind people take when they're about to dive into cold, deep water. The one with the goatee. His name's Rhett Callahan. His family practically owns half the county. Callahan Construction. They get all the big contracts, the new high school gym, the road paving, everything. The name landed with a dull thud. Arthur knew the name. Everyone in Jasper Creek knew it. Rhett's father, a slick politician in a businessman's suit, had run the show for decades. Rhett was his heir apparent, a prince who had inherited a kingdom of gravel pits and bulldozers. Sarah continued her words, tumbling out. Rhett and his crew, they've been coming in more and more lately. Ever since the old owner, Mr. Henderson, sold the place. His son Caleb runs it now. He's young. He doesn't know how to handle them. She paused, swallowing hard. Last week I heard Rhett complaining to Caleb at the bar. He said your type makes his guys uncomfortable. That this is a family place and certain elements are bad for the atmosphere. My type. Arthur's voice was dangerously calm. A 72-year-old man who fought for this country. No, she whispered, and a single tear escaped, tracing a glistening path down her cheek. She wiped it away angrily. He meant the cap. He said symbols like that. They stir things up, bring up a past people want to forget. A cold, familiar rage began to smolder in Arthur's chest, a dormant fire he had spent 50 years learning to control. The past people want to forget. He had lived that past. He had watched friends die in it. And this sniveling coward in a custom-tailored shirt dared to tell him it was an inconvenience. And the manager, Caleb. Arthur pressed his focus, narrowing. He just lets this happen. Sarah's face was a mask of helpless frustration. Caleb needs their business. Rhett's crew comes in 3-4 times a week. Big group, big tabs. They tip in cash, big wads of it. Caleb's in debt from buying the restaurant. He's terrified of losing that money. So he nods. He says he'll look into it. But what he really does is he comes to me and tells me to make sure the problem goes away quietly. So the new waitress, the one nobody knew, the one who was desperate for the job, she was the chosen instrument, the disposable tool to carry out the coward's bidding. It was a classic tactic of intimidation. Isolate, weaken, remove. So why tell me? Arthur asked, his voice softening slightly. He needed to understand her motive. Was it pity, righteousness, or something else entirely? Sarah finally looked up, her blue eyes meeting his, and for the first time he saw past the fear to the core of steel beneath it. Because my daddy was a Marine, died in a training accident at Pendleton when I was 6. All I have left of him is his dress blues folded in a cedar chest and a single photo. He believed in standing for something. He taught me that silence is a choice. It's an endorsement. Her voice grew stronger, firmer. And I won't endorse this. I can't. My son, I have a 4-year-old boy. What am I supposed to teach him? To look away when something's wrong because you're scared, to let the bullies win because it's easier? A profound respect, sharp and clear, cut through Arthur's anger. This girl, this Sarah, wasn't just a victim. She was a fighter just like him. She was just fighting a different kind of war on a different kind of battlefield. Rhett Callahan, Arthur said, testing the name on his tongue again. You know him from before. A shadow passed over her face. A darker memory. We were in high school together. He was a senior when I was a freshman. He was a monster then too, the entitled kind, the kind who knew he'd never face consequences. His daddy's money smoothed everything over. Fights, vandalism, a DUI. It all just vanished. He used to target people. For fun. She shuddered, a full-body tremor. He used to lock me and my friends in the janitor's closet, just for a laugh, to hear us scream. Everyone knew. No one did a thing. A puzzle piece clicked into place. This wasn't just a random act of prejudice against an old veteran. This was a continuation. A lifelong bully who had never been checked was now testing the fences of his new adult playground. And Arthur, by the simple act of existing, had become the new target. Arthur leaned forward, his forearms resting on the table, creating an intimate circle of conspiracy between them. His voice was no longer a question, but a statement of intent. You came over here to tell me this because you had a choice to make. You could warn me hoping I'd leave. Or you could warn me hoping I'd stand my ground. I don't scare easy, Sarah. And I sure as hell don't leave when some 2-bit tyrant tells me I'm not welcome. A wave of something relief, fear, validation washed over her face. I just wanted you to be ready, she confessed in a whisper. I didn't want you to be blindsided. They cornered the last person they didn't like in the parking lot. A family just passing through. They didn't hurt them, just surrounded their car until they drove away terrified. No one called the cops. Arthur slowly picked up his lukewarm, lemonless tea, took a long swallow, and set the glass down with a decisive click. "Well," he said, a grim smile touching his lips for the first time that night. "Now I'm ready." But readiness was one thing. The reality was another. There were still 50 feet of worn linoleum, 5 tables of oblivious diners, and 4 pairs of hostile eyes between him and the heart of the problem. Just then, a sharp, commanding voice barked from the kitchen. "Sarah, table 7 needs a check now." It was a man's voice. Caleb, the manager. It wasn't a request. It was a leash being yanked. Sarah flinched, as if struck. She shot Arthur an apologetic, frightened look, scrambled out of the chair, and hurried away her duty as a waitress, pulling her back into the lion's den. Arthur watched her go. Then he turned his attention back to the booth in the corner. Their quiet conversation had stopped. They were all watching him now. Openly. The smirk on Rhett Callahan's face had widened. It was a look of smug satisfaction. The look of a predator who has successfully isolated his prey. Arthur Morgan remained perfectly still, a silent granite statue in a sea of noise. The game had begun, and Rhett Callahan had just made the catastrophic mistake of assuming he knew the rules. Arthur let them watch. Let them simmer in their own cheap bravado. He'd learned in the jungle that the creature who moves first often loses. He calmly folded his paper napkin into a neat square, a small, deliberate act of order in a room rapidly descending into chaos. He was a storm cloud gathering energy, waiting for the right moment to break. It came sooner than he expected. The scrape of a chair across the floor announced an arrival. A figure loomed over his table, blocking the dim light from the overhead fixtures. Arthur didn't look up immediately. He let the intruder stand there, stewing in the silence. "You're a hard man to get a hint," a voice drawled, slick with unearned authority. It was a voice accustomed to being obeyed. Slowly, Arthur raised his head. Rhett Callahan stood before him, all smirking confidence and manicured aggression. He was wearing a shirt that probably cost more than Arthur's monthly mortgage payment, but it couldn't hide the ugliness underneath. He looked like a man who'd never done a day of honest labor in his life. "I hear hints just fine," Arthur replied, his voice level. "I just don't take orders from spoiled children playing King of the Hill." Rhett's smirk faltered for a millisecond before he plastered it back on. He smoothly slid into the seat opposite Arthur, the one Sarah had just vacated. He leaned back, feigning a casual air, as if this were a friendly chat between neighbors. "Now see, that's where you're wrong. I'm not playing. I own the hill. This town, this steakhouse, it's my backyard. And I like to keep my backyard tidy." "Funny," Arthur said, not a trace of humor in his eyes. "Last I checked, this was a public establishment in the United States of America, a country I seem to recall defending a time or two." He gestured with his chin toward his cap. Rhett chuckled a low, condescending sound. "Oh, we all thank you for your service, old-timer. We really do. But that was then. This is now. And now your little costume party." He flicked his eyes at the cap. "It's provocative. It makes folks edgy. It's bad for business." "The only thing bad for business in this room," Arthur countered, his gaze unwavering, "is a bully with a trust fund who thinks his money buys him the right to dictate who can and can't eat a steak in peace." Rhett leaned forward, the pretense of friendliness evaporating like morning mist. His voice dropped to a venomous whisper. "Let me be crystal clear, old man. This isn't a debate. This is a notification. My guys and I, we spend a lot of money in here. Caleb knows who keeps the lights on. He can't afford to lose us. But you're one cheap steak dinner a week. You're disposable." Arthur absorbed the threat without a flicker of expression. He had faced down men with RPGs and bayonets. This child with a platinum credit card was nothing. "Let me tell you something about men like me," Arthur said, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of buried cannons. "We've seen real trouble. We've faced down actual monsters. You're not even a good copy. You're just a loud noise in an empty room desperate for an echo." Rhett's face flushed a deep, mottled red. The insult had hit its mark. For a man built on a foundation of entitlement, being called empty was the deepest cut. "You think you're tough, huh? With your war stories and your 1,000-yard stare, you're a relic, an antique, and nobody cares what you think anymore." He gestured vaguely toward the kitchen doors. "You think that little waitress came to you out of the goodness of her heart? She's terrified. You staying here making a stand, you're not protecting her. You're putting a target on her back. When my guys decide to take their business down the road to Applebee's, whose tips do you think are going to dry up? Whose kid is going to go without because you had to prove a point?" That was the move, the cowardly, brilliant move, to turn Sarah's act of courage into a weapon against her, to make Arthur the villain of her story. It was a vile, effective piece of psychological warfare. Arthur's gaze shifted from Rhett to the corner booth. The other three men were watching a pack of hyenas waiting for their leader to signal the attack. Then his eyes found Sarah, who was nervously wiping down an already clean table across the room, pretending not to listen, her posture radiating fear. He turned back to Rhett. "You know, somewhere along the line, someone should have taught you a lesson about picking on people you perceive as weaker than you. Looks like they all failed." "And you're going to teach me?" Rhett scoffed. Arthur pushed his chair back slowly, the legs scraping against the floor, a sound that cut through the diner's hum. He rose to his full height, not with the creaking reluctance of a 72-year-old, but with the coiled energy of a predator. He was still a big man, his shoulders broad from a life of discipline. He towered over the seated Rhett. "No." Arthur said, his voice a low thunderclap that seemed to make the silverware vibrate. "I'm not going to teach you. I'm going to show you what happens when your target doesn't run." Without another word, Arthur turned and walked away from the table. Not toward the exit, not toward the bar. He walked with calm, deliberate steps toward the men's restroom at the back of the building. It was a calculated retreat, a way to de-escalate the immediate confrontation while seizing control of the timeline. He needed a moment. To think. To plan. To let Rhett wonder what was coming next. He splashed cold water on his face, the shock of it clearing his head. He looked at the old man in the mirror, the weary eyes, the deep lines etched around his mouth. He was tired of this fight. It was a fight he thought he'd left behind in the mud and the monsoons. But here it was again in a steakhouse in East Texas wearing a different uniform. The enemy wasn't a soldier in black pajamas anymore. It was the smiling, insidious rot of homegrown hatred. When he stepped out of the restroom 5 minutes later, the world had changed. The corner booth was empty. Rhett and his goons were gone. And so was Sarah. A cold dread, sharper than any he'd felt in the jungle, coiled in Arthur's gut. The empty corner booth wasn't a retreat. It was a repositioning. He scanned the dining room. It was half empty now, the Friday night dinner rush thinning out. Brenda, his old waitress, was back, laughing with a customer at the bar. She hadn't seen a thing. Arthur returned to his booth. His meal, the ribeye and loaded potato, sat on the table cold and untouched. It had been delivered while he was gone. A silent, taunting message. Eat up and get out. But Sarah's absence was a blaring alarm. He flagged down a young busboy, a kid with acne and worried eyes. "My waitress, Sarah. Where did she go?" Arthur asked, keeping his voice steady. The boy shrugged, avoiding eye contact. I think Caleb sent her home. Said she wasn't feeling well." "She wasn't feeling well." Arthur repeated the words, tasting like ash. A lie. A convenient, cowardly lie. She hadn't left. She'd been dismissed. Silenced. Punished for her brief, shining moment of bravery. The rage he'd been banking all night finally roared to life. This would not stand. He strode toward the back of the restaurant, past the swinging kitchen doors to a small, cluttered office where Caleb Landry, the inheritor of the Hickory Barrel, was hunched over a pile of receipts, pretending to be busy. He was a young man in his late 20s, with his father's frame, but none of his confidence. He looked up, startled, as Arthur filled the doorway. "Mr. Morgan," Caleb stammered, his eyes wide with a practiced innocence. "Is everything all right with your meal?" "Where is she, Caleb?" Arthur's voice was quiet, but it had the deadly focus of a sniper's scope. "Who? Oh, Sarah, I had to send her home. She had a migraine. The stress, you know." Arthur took a step into the small office, crowding the space, making it impossible for Caleb to look away. "Don't you lie to me, son. Don't you dare. You fired that girl because she stood up to that parasite Rhett Callahan. You fired her because you were too damn scared to do it yourself." Caleb flinched, color flooding his face. "You don't understand," he insisted, his voice rising in panic. "Rhett Callahan is not just some customer. His company is pouring the foundation for the new subdivision I just bought a house in. His uncle is the head of the bank that holds my business loan. You think I can just kick him out? He could ruin me with a single phone call. So you sacrifice a single mother trying to feed her child to save your own skin." Arthur's voice dripped with contempt. "Your father, Mr. Henderson, he was a good man. He ran this place with honor. He treated everyone who walked through that door with respect. He would be ashamed of you. Deeply and profoundly ashamed." The words struck Caleb like a physical blow. He sank into his chair, the fight draining out of him. "What was I supposed to do?" he whispered, his face in his hands. "You were supposed to be a man," Arthur said simply. He stared at the pathetic figure of Caleb for a long moment. There was no fight here, just weakness. And weakness was a disease. He turned without another word and walked back out into the dining room. He stopped at his table, pulled his wallet from his back pocket, and laid a $50 bill on the table, enough to cover his untouched meal and a generous tip that Sarah would now never receive. He walked toward the front door, the eyes of the remaining patrons following his every step. But as he reached the door, he stopped. He turned back, his gaze sweeping the room. He wasn't talking to Caleb anymore. He was talking to everyone. To the farmers, the mechanics, the curious onlookers. His voice wasn't loud, but it resonated with a lifetime of command. "I've been coming to this place every Friday for 6 years, he began. "I never said much. I kept to myself. But tonight I learned something. I learned that this place, it isn't what it used to be. It's become a place where bullies are coddled and good people are punished for telling the truth." A heavy silence fell over the restaurant. Brenda stopped polishing a glass. A couple in a booth froze with their forks halfway to their mouths. "You all saw it," Arthur continued, his gaze piercing. "You saw that boy Callahan and his cronies. You see them every week. You hear the things they say. You see who they stare at. And you do nothing. You look at your plates. You look at your phones. You look anywhere but at the problem, hoping it'll just go away. But it won't. Evil isn't a storm that passes. It's a cancer. And silence is the sunshine it needs to grow." He let his words hang in the air, a final damning indictment. Then he looked directly at Caleb's office door. "This isn't about one old soldier's dinner anymore. It's about what kind of town this is, what kind of people you want to be." He put on his cap, adjusting it with a steady hand. He opened the door and stepped out into the cool Texas night, leaving a crater of ringing silence behind him. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun. And his next battlefield wouldn't be inside the hickory barrel. It would be the entire town of Jasper Creek. What do you think is going to happen next? Will the townspeople finally stand up, or will they retreat back into their silence? Before we get to the explosive conclusion, take a second to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This is a story about community courage and consequences, and you're part of it now. Arthur didn't go home. He couldn't. The cold fury churning in his stomach wouldn't allow for rest. He drove his F-150 through the quiet, sleeping streets of Jasper Creek, the glow of the dashboard casting a green pall on his grim face. He wasn't a planner, not in the traditional sense. He was a strategist. He didn't build intricate schemes. He identified weak points and applied overwhelming pressure. Rhett Callahan's weak point wasn't his body, it was his reputation. And Caleb Landry's weak point wasn't his courage, it was his father's legacy. He knew where Sarah lived. A few months back, his truck had a flat tire right outside the small, dilapidated duplex on the east side of town, and she, on her way to work with her son in tow, had stopped to help him. He now drove there, parking his truck across the street. The lights were on in one window. He saw a silhouette moving inside. He could go knock on her door, offer her money solace, a promise of vengeance. But what good would that do? It would be charity, and this wasn't about charity. It was about justice. So he sat, and he watched. He was standing guard. He didn't know what he was watching for, but his instincts, honed over a lifetime of vigilance, told him to stay put. An hour passed. Then, just as he was beginning to question his purpose, a sleek, black pickup truck, far too new and clean for this part of town, rolled slowly down the street. It was Rhett Callahan's truck. It passed Sarah's house, once slowed down, then circled the block, and came back, its headlights cutting across her front window before it finally sped off into the darkness. It was a quiet pass-by. No honking, no shouting. But it was an unmistakable message. A predator circling its prey. I know where you live. I know where your son sleeps. The rage inside Arthur solidified into something cold and hard and clear. This was the line. They had just crossed it. The next morning, Arthur Morgan did something he hadn't done in 50 years. He put on a suit. Not a modern one, but the dark gray suit he'd worn to his wife's funeral 12 years prior. It was a suit of solemn purpose. He drove not to the steakhouse, but to the Jasper Creek Town Hall. He walked into the office of the mayor, a portly, self-satisfied man named Bill Slocum, who was also coincidentally Rhett Callahan's uncle-in-law. "Arthur, good to see you," Mayor Slocum boomed, standing to shake his hand. "What can I do for Jasper Creek's most distinguished veteran this fine morning?" Arthur didn't take the offered hand. "I'm here to talk about a rot in this town, Bill. A rot that starts in your nephew's construction company and is poisoning everything it touches." He then proceeded in a calm, detailed, and unshakable voice to recount the events of the previous night. The threats at the hickory barrel, the firing of a single mother, the late-night intimidation at her home. Mayor Slocum's folksy smile slowly dissolved, replaced by a tight, wary expression. "Now, Arthur," he said, sitting down and steepling his fingers. "Rhett can be boisterous, a little rough around the edges, but he's a good boy, a job creator. He's vital to this community's economy. And this waitress. Are we sure we have the whole story? I hear she's had some troubles in the past. Are you calling a decorated veteran of the United States Army a liar, Mayor?" Arthur asked, his voice flat. "Of course not. I'm simply suggesting that perhaps there are two sides to every— There's only one side to this bill, Arthur cut in. The side of decency. And you're on the wrong side of it. Callahan Construction gets every major municipal contract in this county. I have a feeling the State Bidding Commission in Austin might be very interested to hear about the coercive and monopolistic business practices being employed right here in Jasper Creek. I'm sure the state auditors would love to take a fine-tooth comb through the last 10 years of this town's books. The mayor's face went pale. The blood drained from it, leaving behind a waxy gray sheen. You wouldn't. Try me, Arthur said. Correct this, or I will. He turned and walked out of the office, leaving the mayor stewing in a puddle of his own political peril. His next stop was the First National Bank of Jasper Creek, where he asked for a meeting with the president, Mr. Abernathy, a man whose signature was on Caleb Landry's business loan. Arthur laid out the same story, but with a different angle. A business that caters to bigotry and intimidation is a high-risk investment, Mr. Abernathy, Arthur explained. It creates a toxic environment. It drives away customers. Reputations once soiled are very hard to clean. The Hickory Barrel is quickly becoming known as a place of intolerance. That's a bad brand, and bad brands lead to bad balance sheets. I'd be very concerned about the long-term viability of that loan if I were you. From the bank, he went to the local VFW post, where he told his story to a dozen other veterans. Old men with eyes like his, men who understood the language of silent threats and hard lines. They listened, their faces growing grim. By noon, the invisible network of Jasper Creek was humming with a new tune. Whispers were spreading like wildfire. Phones were ringing. Powerful men were having uncomfortable conversations they never expected to have. Arthur Morgan had not fired a single shot, but he had launched a full-scale assault on the power structure that enabled Rhett Callahan. He had turned their own system of influence and connection against them. That afternoon, a bewildered-looking Caleb Landry showed up on Arthur Morgan's front porch. He stood there, twisting a baseball cap in his hands, looking like a chastised schoolboy. Mr. Morgan. He began, his voice barely a whisper. My phone hasn't stopped ringing all day. The bank, the mayor's office. My primary food supplier said he heard there was trouble at my place. Arthur just looked at him, waiting. I messed up, Caleb choked out, his eyes welling with tears. I was scared. I've got everything tied up in that place. My father's life savings, my future. I made a cowardly choice. Yes, you did, Arthur agreed. The question is, what are you going to do about it? I drove to Sarah's house an hour ago, Caleb said, looking up, his expression desperate. I offered her job back, with a raise, and I told her she would never ever be asked to compromise her integrity for a customer again. Not for Rhett Callahan, not for anyone. I told her I was sorry. And, Arthur pressed, she told me to go to hell. A dry, humorless laugh escaped Caleb's lips. And I don't blame her. Arthur nodded slowly. Rebuilding trust takes more than an apology, son. It takes action. Consistent, difficult action. I know, Caleb said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. It was a neatly printed sign. He handed it to Arthur. Arthur read the words printed in bold black letters. The Hickory Barrel is a place for everyone. We welcome all who treat their fellow patrons and our staff with dignity and respect. Those who cannot abide by this simple principle of decency are welcome to take their business elsewhere. Caleb Landry, proprietor. Arthur looked from the sign to the young man in front of him. He saw a flicker of his father's spine finally beginning to grow. It's a start, Arthur said, handing the sign back. Put it on the front door, and mean it. Caleb nodded, his face a mixture of terror and resolve. I will. As he turned to leave, he paused. "Mr. Morgan, what about Rhett?" "Don't you worry about Rhett." Arthur said, his eyes darkening. "I have a feeling he's about to discover that his kingdom is a lot smaller than he thought it was." 1 week later, on the Friday night, Arthur Morgan once again pulled his F-150 into the parking lot of the Hickory Barrel. The sign was on the door exactly as Caleb had promised. Inside, the atmosphere was different. Quieter, but not with tension. It was a more relaxed quiet. The corner booth, Rhett's old throne room, was occupied by a young family with 3 noisy children all smearing ketchup on their faces. Arthur took his seat at the window booth. A moment later, a figure appeared at his table. It was Sarah. She was wearing the same apron, but her shoulders were back. Her head was high, and the smile that greeted him was genuine, reaching all the way to her clear blue eyes. "Evening, Arthur," she said, her voice steady and warm. "Sarah," he replied, a genuine warmth in his own voice. "Good to see you." "We saved this table for you," she said. "Caleb's orders. He said it's to be permanently reserved." She looked around the room. "It's been different this week. Some of Rhett's crew tried to come in on Tuesday. Caleb met them at the door, pointed to the sign, and told them they were welcome to stay if they could behave like civilized human beings. They turned around and left. Haven't seen them since." She told him Caleb had driven to her house again the day before. He hadn't asked for forgiveness. He'd just handed her an envelope with 2 weeks' severance pay and another one with her back pay plus the raise. And he'd brought a brand new tricycle for her son. He said he would hold her job for her for as long as it took for her to trust him again. She'd told him she'd see him Friday. Arthur nodded, a deep sense of satisfaction settling in his chest. "How's the tea tonight?" he asked. Her smile widened. "Strong, unsweetened, and the lemon is waiting." When his steak arrived, it was perfect. And for the first time in a very long time at the Hickory Barrel, it was more than just a meal. It was a victory. As he ate, he watched Caleb Landry moving through the restaurant, not hiding in his office, but talking to customers, refilling drinks, clearing plates. He looked terrified and exhausted, and for the first time, proud. This is what true change looks like. It isn't always a fiery explosion. Sometimes it's a quiet, determined realignment. It's the courage of one person sparking the conscience of another. It's the quiet power of decency refusing to be silenced. What started as a whispered threat ended with a clear statement for all to see. A community isn't defined by its bullies. It's defined by the people who refuse to bow to them. Arthur Morgan left the Hickory Barrel that night, knowing his work was done. The peace he'd guarded so fiercely was no longer his alone to defend. He had passed the torch. And in a small steakhouse in East Texas, a light had been switched back on a light that no amount of darkness could ever extinguish again. Thank you for being with us on this journey. Stories like these remind us that a single voice, a single act of courage can change everything. If this story moved you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories that explore the very best and sometimes the very worst of human nature. Until next time, stand tall and never let anyone tell you where you do and don't belong.